Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hannah Zubairi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. On today's segment, we'll be discussing unsolicited surveillance of the American Muslim community, entrapment, and the harmful ramifications of programs such as CVE that leave behind on the broader community, in which people become unwillingly criminalized. Many times, law enforcement prevention techniques, programs are viewed as problematic. While safety and security are important, the issues that become prevalent, however, is the focus on which these programs place. CVE programs fail because they're focused on suppressing ideas rather than reducing violence, say experts. When more than half of the violent crimes committed in the United States go unsolved each year, law enforcement resources should not be wasted on CVE programs that have proven to be ineffective and discriminatory in practice. Our guests joining us today are Faiza Patel and Ayaan Dahir. Faiza has served as the co-director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. She's testified before Congress opposing the dragnet surveillance of Muslims, organized advocacy efforts against state laws, and developed legislation creating an independent inspector general of the New York Police Department. She works at the Brennan Center, which is a core justice group located at NYU. She has been published widely in academic outlets as well. Our second guest is Ayaan Dahir, one of the founders and members of Young Muslim Collective, a Minneapolis-based youth-led grassroots organization. They have organized around racial and social justice issues through education and action. They're youth who want to create social change by uplifting their community and bringing awareness to social issues that plague their community in Minnesota. Young Muslim Collective works to create a space that allows for substantial growth. And particularly because Ayaan's community has been a target of these CVE programs, and we really want to hear from her. She's a multifaceted activist, and right now she's actually at a protest in Minnesota on the issue we were discussing yesterday, which was the murder of George Floyd. Ayaan, can you hear me? Assalamu alaikum, Ayaan. Can you hear me? We can hear sounds and noises from the back. Are you at a protest? Okay, I'm going to, perhaps we can have our producers check out Ayaan's audio and bring her back into the discussion. Faiza, let's start talking about CVE. We, I've interviewed you before as well when I used to write for the newspaper. And today on Muslim Network TV, we want to discuss CVE. Can you tell me what is CVE? Can you tell the audience?
Well, sure. It's a long story, though. Well, CVE is many things to many people. So let's start with what it stands for. So CVE stands for Countering Violent Extremism. And obviously, since the attacks of 9/11, there has been a great deal of focus at the federal level here in the US and also at the state and local level to prevent terrorism. And a lot of the early models about how terrorism came to emerge in the United States really took the view that there was this process of radicalization. So the idea basically was that young Muslims, mainly men, would be exposed to radical ideas and that they would adopt those ideas and over time would go on to commit acts of violence, acts of terrorism, if you will. The difficulty with these kinds of models was twofold. First of all, they focused on very broad criteria that were very that applied to a lot of Muslims. So, for example, they thought that increasing religiosity was a sign that someone was becoming radicalized and could become a terrorist, or even something like growing a beard or stopping drinking and gambling. Those were the kinds of things that they said would are sort of pre-indicators of somebody who is going to become a terrorist. The second thing that was really troubling about these ideas was that they often focused on basically protected behavior. They looked at elements of political activism, they looked at elements of religion, again, focusing on Muslim communities. And the third thing that was really problematic was that they assumed that, once you had this kind of list of identifiers, you could go out and, watch Muslim communities and pick out the people who exhibited these behaviors. And then you would have at your fingertips a kind of a pool of terrorism suspects. So these were the ideas that were very much in fashion, I would say 2007, 2008, somewhere in that time. So quite a while ago now. They generated a lot of pushback, first of all, because they were empirically unsound. So when you actually looked at terrorism, you found that the kinds of indicators that these models suggested you look for weren't always there. There were people who committed terrorist acts who never really adopted any kind of violent ideology. And there were people who adopted sort of violent ideologies but never committed a terrorist act. So they were both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. Secondly, the fact that they focused so much on Muslim political and religious behavior generated a lot of pushback from the civil liberties community and also from Muslim American organizations. So over time, this idea sort of, became a little less fashionable amongst national security circles. So the next step then was a kind of a reframing of these programs into countering violent extremism. And one of the reasons that I think that framing was chosen was that it's kind of neutral, right? Like, who could be against countering violent extremism? It seems like a bad thing, and we want to prevent it. So should we all be taking part in this great endeavor? The problem was that CVE basically used exactly the same sort of models as the radicalization models had done, right? So again, it was the same thing, a checklist of things that you should watch for in Muslim communities. And that would then give you a list of people who are suspicious, and you could go on and surveil them and potentially prosecute them if you caught them doing something wrong, or perhaps even get them in immigration situations. The sort of innovation that came about really in the Obama administration in a more structured way was that they said, all right, well, it's really hard for us as the FBI and the local cops to really know what's going on in Muslim communities, right? We have all these community outreach programs, but people don't really trust us. They don't really want to talk to us. But we want them to identify these radicals who are in the communities. And so basically then they started these programs, which were, many of which were aimed at sort of training local community members and leaders in particular to be looking out for signs of radicalization, to be looking out for people who might speak up about Palestine or might speak up about what was happening in Syria. Or kids who felt that that there was tension between Islamic values and American values. I mean, pretty common standard things that people bring up. So that was one sort of set of CVE programs that came about. There were two other elements to CVE in the Obama years which are worth mentioning. So one is that a lot of these programs were aimed at sort of ferreting out potential terrorists. Based on these really overbroad criteria. But there were also programs that were aimed at sort of uplifting communities. So, in particular, the idea was that some people might turn to terrorism because they don't have economic or educational opportunities. it sounds sort of intuitive, but the reality is that that's not what the research shows at all. In fact, that there's no real correlation between poverty and terrorism or any of that. But some of the programs, and particularly in Minneapolis, were sort of framed as, well, we're going to give young people access to training programs and internships, and that's going to help reduce terrorism. Now, I've got nothing against internships and training programs, but I do think that framing those as a kind of a security imperative is really problematic, and it basically securitizes the relationship with a community in a way that's really unproductive. And then the last one I'll mention briefly is there's a lot of counter messaging funding as well. So basically the idea was, well, this is an ideological battle, and so we need people to effectively counter message against, it was ISIS at this time, not Al-Qaeda. And who better than Muslims themselves to take up that banner? So let's fund people to actually develop and promulgate counter messaging on these issues. So that was the sort of three prongs of CVE under Obama. And there were basically, there were several kinds of programs, but I'll mention two. So one was, there were three pilot programs in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and Boston. Their U.S. attorneys in those cities were charged with sort of developing these programs, in consultation with community leaders there. And then the Department of Homeland Security was also given $10 million in grants to give out to community groups and law enforcement and others to implement CVE. So that's kind of where we were at the end of Obama. And it was a difficult time because, look, if I'm a small nonprofit operating somewhere and I'm providing services to my community and I can get funding from the government, it's a very attractive proposition, right? And the fact that it's called CVE probably doesn't mean that much to me. And so you did have, some Muslim groups applying for these kinds of funds. You had some that actually refused to apply for them on people because they recognized that these funds were, came with a problematic assumption that Muslims were prone to become terrorists, and so we needed to do these special things to monitor them. When Trump took over, of course, the posture changed, right? Because now you could see, the very overtly anti-Muslim sentiments expressed by the new president. Some organizations withdrew from being considered for funding. Others stayed in the mix. But in any event, the Trump administration decided that, well, we don't know what the Obama administration did, so we're going to review all these grant programs. And they went back and withdrew the grants that they had awarded but not paid out, and then put in a whole new set of organizations to get these grants. And we examined those grants about a year and a half ago, and what we found was that 85% of the grants were actually directed towards Muslims and communities of color. And they basically, a lot of them really sort of start from the premise that, well, if you've been discriminated against, whether you're an immigrant or a refugee or you're a Muslim in post 9/11 America, that you are likely to become a terrorist, or at least you're vulnerable to becoming a terrorist. And so we need these programs to help you with that.
So these programs came with, they came with that assumption that, everybody is looked through the lens of national security, but that they also come with strings attached. So if I took this grant, if my organization took a grant, would I be, what was expected of me in return?
So I think the answer to that is not 100% clear, right? So, and you kind of have to go back to what kind of CVE program you're talking about, right? So for me, the most problematic parts of those programs are the ones that say, right, we're going to give you community group X number of dollars, and we're going to, give you training and help you identify who's a potential terrorist in your community. community, right? And with that, then, what happens, right? So supposing I'm a community group, I take this money and I'm like, all right, well, I've got my list, and, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find people who I think might be potential terrorists, right? So whatever that might mean to you. But then what do you do, right? Like, what do you do once you've identified a potential terrorist? If you're, a community organization or a leader, like, you can't just sit on that information, right? You got to do something with it, right? And I think that's where a lot of the problems comes into this, which is that, these programs were run very in close cooperation with law enforcement. So that meant that people who were potentially being identified on really baseless criteria could then be flagged as, oh, look at Muhammad there. I think he's, really troubled, and, he talks all, he criticizes the United States and our foreign policy in Syria. Gosh, maybe he's going to become a terrorist. And what you report that into the FBI or to the local police, who are your partners in these programs, and then that person becomes basically has a target on their back, right?
And it plays really, like, it worked in sync with the fact that there are FBI agents who are in mosques, who are surveilling already, and so and who are agent provocateurs, who are talking this talk up. So
Right.
now, so it's like coming in through the front door and the back door and into the Muslim communities. Do you think that CVE institutionalized Islamophobia? And how, if you agree with that, how did it do that?
I mean, it's institutionalized Islamophobia. I mean, I've never used that term myself, but I mean, I can see how it would be applicable given the fact that it proceeds from the assumption, right, that a particular community is more likely to produce terrorists. Now, I would say, and a lot of people still believe that, right, in the United States, because of the 9/11 attacks, because every time that there is an act of violence committed by a Muslim, it is placed in this greater framework of, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, even if it's not particularly related to them. And because, generally speaking, we see this with minority communities all the time, right? If one person from a minority community commits a crime, right, that becomes emblematic of the community at large, right? So, Hispanics are drug dealers and Black people are criminals, right? It's very easy for people to take one example and then project onto the entire community, which is something that we resist doing with the majority community, which brings me to my second point, which is that while all of this sort of really single-minded focus on Muslims was happening, we were seeing an increasing rise in white supremacist, racist organizations in the United States, and with them becoming more and more emboldened to commit violence. So I think that there's definitely something in that kind of core assumption that Muslims are terrorists, which I think is very, very close to as you said, institutionalized Islamophobia.
So now, if we just, like you touched on, white supremacy, so do you think, and this is something that we encounter a lot in our work, and when people will say, oh, what's wrong with, like you said earlier, countering violent extremism, is it, in fact, we should have this against, white supremacists as well. And, we should have these at these white churches and find out what they're doing in there to produce these people. So, so is this like bad policy for everyone?
Yeah, I would say so. And the reason I say that is, when we look at violence, the first thing I'll say is when you look at violence in the United States, right, there's a lot of it, right? Mostly gun violence, and sort of violence that's, somehow related to ideology or justified on an ideological basis is a very, very small sliver of that violence. And yet we spend a disproportionate amount of time focusing on that kind of violence. And the reason we do that is obvious, because, racist violence, for example, is not just about the violence to the individual, but it's a broader message of violence to the community that they come from. So I understand why we are so focused on this, but it is something that to keep in mind, that as you're developing responses, as to how much time and energy you want to spend on this versus other kinds of violence.
Mm.
The second reason why I think it's really, I don't think CVE is a good model for dealing with white supremacists is that I don't think the model works, right? Whether you're talking about Muslims or you're talking about white supremacists, I think the idea that you can look, that there's some kind of, profile of people, and that you can have everybody be on the lookout for that profile is just, it's not borne out by the evidence. There are people who say, well, people who commit mass shootings send out these signals, right? Like people around them might know. But a lot of times what's happening over there is that we have sort of confirmation bias, right? Like when something bad happens, like we'll go back and be like, you remember that? You said that, and I should have done that, etc. Like that's very, very common. So I don't think it works. And I guess the third thing is that I would say that, when you accept this for white supremacists, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up. Because at the end of the day, the odds that the FBI is going to go running around, say white churches, for example, say, you're the 6 signs that your son or daughter is going to become a neo-Nazi is about this much.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's going to happen, right? The thing that's going to happen is those kinds of programs, those kinds of ideas are just going to be turned against minority communities, just as they always have been.
Exactly. So when we, and this is something very interesting. This morning, I was just reading, this investigative journalism report on Bugaloo or something like that. It's called, you're seeing all these big white men in like Hawaiian luau shirts and like, or like Big Igloo is one of their signs. And these are like pro-gun, we'll fight the police, there's going to be a civil war coming. And there are like lots and lots of these groups. And there's, brilliant investigative report done on that. And so, and you're wondering, like, just like exactly what you just said, is that what are the chances of anybody profiling people? And is there like, the CVE program for Muslims was essentially that anybody wearing now a luau shirt, a Hawaiian print shirt, white man walking down the street, like, are we expected to like now be scared of him? Oh my God, he's one of those who wants to bring civil, war to the United States. Mm-hmm. So that is essentially, and I know in my community here in Montgomery County, the Montgomery County model was another version of this CVE, where it was like a softer CVE. It was supposedly community grown, and a lot of us, were interested by like the sudden growth in this one particular organization, $2 million. They come in and they have access everywhere. Later, we find out, the executive director is on the FBI payroll. She's a consultant with them, has worked, it's just, it was, and the scariest part was the mental health angle. Our communities know we need mental health resources like nobody's business, right? And to use mental health as a way to, now we're going to offer you mental health services, but in return, we're going to be identifying young people, refugees, as people who could be a threat to the community. So the most vulnerable in our community were targeted, and through like homeless, making sandwiches for the homeless, things like that, things that, and there was a time where our community people were scared to send their kids to the mosque because they were like, we don't want this. We don't want our kids to be watched. I remember getting a call from a parent whose child had been had just got from middle school to high school and was pulled out, and asked all these questions about like Palestine and their thoughts about Tahrir Square, things like that. So these were specific things that, like, it wasn't just something that it was just a policy and it didn't have effect on community. It affected community. It affected, like, I remember in New York, there was a case where the mother, the son was targeted, like on the Boston bombings. So one of the young men They thought it was him. And even the mother at that point was like, I don't know if my son did that. Like, it was so scary that here this policy can just sort of like divide families, even and lose trust. That was like, do I trust my imam? Is he really like listening to, I trust my mental health counselor. Are they listening to me as someone who, who's like, can our kids even have mood swings anymore? Right. So that was where it had come to. So then now, are other communities still using the Montgomery County model?
I'm so glad you brought up the Montgomery County model, because I didn't mention that when I was talking about the evolution of CVE, but it was, of course, one of the first ones that rolled out, and it rolled out around the time of the pilot programs, although it wasn't a pilot program itself. And it was a remarkable thing they did, because they basically said, well, we looked at a bunch of kids when they were applying for their grant, and I looked very carefully at this. They were like, well, we've gone around the community and we've identified a few kids who we thought might be vulnerable to radicalization. And, one of them was a refugee and he was really homesick, and the other one was having problems in school. So we gave them counseling, which makes us now suddenly an expert and able to both identify potential terrorists and, mind you, bring them back from the brink of whatever horrible thing that they're planning to commit. And the other thing that was so striking about it was how interwoven it was with the police department, the Montgomery County Police, right? It was very much a hand-in-glove.
And the interfaith community.
And in fact, I remember the Montgomery County Police Chief said, well, this is great for us because it gives us, a lot of information and intelligence about the community. I mean, sure, of course it's great from the point of view of the cops. So it was a very influential model because it was actually evaluated by a well-known counterterrorism expert. But the interesting thing was that his evaluation only dealt with their like community outreach part, right? Like where they had also all these programs where kids would come in, people would come in and they'd be taught about, being more open-minded or better citizens or, understanding other communities, etc., but never actually looked at this core problematic piece of the Montgomery County model, which was this identifying people. And so they could go out and say, well, hey, we've been validated, we've been found effective. And so that gave them a lot of influence sort of nationally. So I think that influence has waned since, as you pointed out, the head of the organization left. She left and went to work with the FBI, and then was allied with sort of very conservative causes like Sheriff David Clark, and I understand has since converted as well and is no longer identifying as Muslim, which is fine. I mean, that's her business, but I'm just saying it sort of gives you a sense of the trajectory of that. But I think the point that you brought up, Hina, that I want to come back to, which I think is super important, is this question of mental health, right? So the idea that, it's very, like, if somebody commits a horrible, violent terrorist act, right? It's like a normal human instinct to say, oh my God, he must be crazy. Like only a crazy person could do that to innocent people, right? And so, but the reality is, if you look at the research, it shows that terrorists are not actually more likely to suffer from mental health issues than anybody else. So this idea that terrorism is somehow a mental health issue is not grounded in reality. But the mental health trope serves lots of purposes for different people. So if I am, someone whose family member does something horrible, or someone who knows or is friends with somebody who does something horrible, it's a lot easier for me to say, he's mentally ill, right? Like that not that he's done a terrible thing, but that he's mentally ill and he's been brainwashed, and so that's why he's doing this. So that it's like kind of tricks you psychologically, I think. And then the second thing is, when you go into the mental health space, it also gives it also gives, a lot of room for the government to respond, because now suddenly you're in a public health space where, yes, there are constraints on information sharing normally, but there's a huge national security and public safety exception to sharing information about health. And the government can make it sound like it's a softer, kinder way to deal with the issue than, actually prosecuting people. So I think a lot of people benefited from that. At the same time, I think that there were some people who were actually quite genuine, who were trying to provide mental health services to people who had been in situations of trauma, whether it was a refugee camp or civil war. I mean, there are, many people who are Muslim in the United States who've had these kinds of traumas and could certainly use, mental health counseling, but then it gets caught up as being about counterterrorism rather than being about, mental health, which is a good thing.
Exactly. And when you bring that up, actually, we're going to try and see if we can get Ayaan up. She's at the protest, and she's saying that the police are jamming internet over there. Ayaan, if you could unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. So let's try and see if we can get you online. Yes, can you hear us now?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, excellent. Alhamdulillah. You're at a protest?
Yes. Here we go. Yes. I'm at the protest for George Floyd, who was killed a couple of days ago by Minneapolis PD. And so we're out here protesting and seeking justice for his life.
Thank you for being there. And I think we're going to have one in Baltimore on Monday too. So yes, people should be enraged. Ayaan, your community was targeted by CVE policies, and it had really deep repercussions on the Muslims in your city. Can you share with us what it was like then, and where are things now?
Yeah, absolutely. So Minneapolis is home to the largest Somali diaspora, and it's one of the first CVE pilot cities. And the Somali community is a very tight-knit community. It's a community that is at the intersection of Black racial identity as well as being Muslims and having that faith. And so when Muslims are being targeted, we have to recognize sort of the duality in the ways that they're being targeted by the state. And one of the ways that it's affected the community is it was really tight-knit before CVE. But once CVE was brought in, there was a huge divide between people who were supporting the program and those who were not. And what it's caused is, because there has been an increase in informants and surveillance used by the police departments and then the sheriff's departments, because there is that level of surveillance, there is now, suspicion towards one another, and that tight community bond that was once there is slowly being disintegrated, by surveillance, by that police presence in our mosques, in our schools, and in our neighborhoods. And so CVE has played a really it's been a really toxic, policy that has deeply affected the community here and has eroded those deep community bonds and ties that were once in place, and has created division and mistrust where there once was, a sense of more brotherhood and sisterhood and a deep trust, towards one another. And so CVE has definitely, we always talk about the effects in terms of, the actual informants as well as the surveillance tactics that are being used. But oftentimes we're not talking about what role does that have on the mental health of the community, and also the way that people see community because of CVE and the role that it's played through surveillance.
And so, and I know that there have been cases in your community and Muslim community, and the Somali community really does want to make a serious effort in curbing any sort of extremism that they, everybody wants to live a safe, healthy life. That's why they escaped out of war-torn zones. They don't want that sort of, to live in that environment or have to fear that. So keeping that in mind, and seeing what your community has gone through, what are ways that you feel could be positive ways that this can be curbed? I know that your community, there were incidents when young men were targeted, and even mosques even closed down doors, would not even let families have prayer services for these young men. So things like that, because they don't want to be associated with anything that is mild, even remotely connected to terrorism. So keeping that in mind, what are some suggestions that you would have as alternatives to this bad policy?
Yeah, so I would say two things to that. The first is that the community it has already been doing a really good job of checking that, right? So before you had, when people were either misguided or they were going down a path, you would have people reach out to them. You would have elders check in. There would be some sort of community counseling. But because of CVE, because now there's this fear that mosques have, that if there's any talk of extremism inside the mosque, or if there's any whispers of that law enforcement is going to come down full force and hold them accountable. CVE has essentially detracted from that process, that holistic community-led process, right, of checking in, of counseling, of leading and guiding and mentoring one another. And so it's the program has actually hindered it. The second thing I want to point out is that most acts of domestic terrorism are committed by white people. And so rarely do we see a CVE program, of going into sort of affluent white neighborhoods and where things that you've seen for the Muslim community or the African or Black communities, rarely do that type of approach towards white communities. And the reason why is because we recognize the humanity of white communities, but we want to demonize and portray Muslims in a negative light, and we don't see the humanity there. One thing I can speak to is locally there's this program led by an individual, a CVE proponent, who went in to speak with children as young as second graders about terrorism and about preventing that. And so what that does is, and of course without the parents' permission or knowledge, and so what that does is it assumes that Muslims are inherently violent and that they need rehabilitation, as children, without really ever recognizing, the role of white supremacists in this country, the role of white supremacy in this country, and what white terrorism has done for hundreds of years to Black and brown people in this country. And so I think it's really important to look, when we're talking about extremism, to look at the whole picture, right? And not allow the state to define, and this administration to define what is extremism and who are the key actors.
So where is it, like, what has changed under the Trump administration in Minnesota?
I mean, I think the one thing I can say about the Trump administration is that they've just been more blatant about the something that was already going on under Barack Obama's administration. That's how the program was brought in, and there was a lot of soft language, a lot of surveillance and surveillance and entrapment was hidden by languages around community policing and community initiatives and sort of making it look like it was grassroots. But the CVE program was never grassroots. It was brought in by the Department of Justice, and locally here it was brought in by DA Lugar. And what it did was it entrapped young men, and it made surveillance of these communities more prevalent. And so under Trump, what I can say is that it's pretty much the same policy, but they're going to name Muslims and they're going to identify, that this program is specifically meant to target Muslims and not under and not pretend that the state is really going after white supremacists, because they're not.
And this, when we talk about, and this is something now with the election coming up and with Biden coming, if he wins, this is something that troubles me, and I want to get both your and Biden's thoughts on this, because what I felt under Trump, because it was so blatant and the gloves came off, and it was just, we knew what what it is, right? Like it was, what he says is what it is, right? And so there were many more allies, even people who were sort of like iffy about CVE before, now saw what it was for and came on, from the dark side to the light, right? So, but now suppose Biden wins and we go back to that sort of CVE that is like very nefarious, sort of nefarious, behind curtains, like we'll packet it in a way that's sweet to the Muslim community. And we go back to that. That is something like, what would you, I hate to say it this way, would you rather have it this way, or would you rather have it that way?
Hannah, either way, I see young Muslims that will be entrapped, and so that is the number one thing that I'm looking at under a Biden administration. The Biden administration would have to do a lot of work to clean up the damage and the harm caused by the CVE program that was brought in by the Obama administration and continued under the Trump administration. I'm not sure if I have a lot of hope for that right now, because I am seeing Biden antagonizing American Muslims even more with his comments on BDS and his platform there. And so, if the Biden administration wants to move in good faith and actually prevent extremism and stop the entrapments and discrimination against Muslims, they've got a lot of work to do with that program. I think it should be scrapped entirely. I think I believe it has a false premise. I believe it has a bad foundation, and therefore, fundamentally, I don't think much can be changed without changing that. And so the Biden administration has a lot of work to do to prove to Muslims that that their administration isn't going to be a continuation of Obama's administration bringing in the CVE program and Trump continuing it.
Faiza, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Isn't a Republican thing, and it isn't a Democratic thing. It's a bipartisan thing. There has been bipartisan support for CVE, not just in the White House, but also in Congress. Remember that the CVE grant programs that were distributed by DHS were actually funding that was approved by Congress and continues to be approved by Congress until just this year, right, where they appropriated money. They renamed it something else, but it's still basically the same program doing the same thing. So, I think that at least where it comes to the two major political parties, we have a really an uphill battle convincing them that these programs are unfounded and damaging to American Muslims and that they should just roll them back. I think the one, small advantage, and it is a small advantage, I think, of an Obama or a Biden administration is that you at least had the opportunity to advocate for limiting these programs in some ways, and you would continue to have this conversation. Unfortunately, the conversation didn't really lead us too far, but they at least acknowledged that there were civil liberties risks, that there were risks of discrimination in these programs. So if we do have another Democratic administration, I think that we would have to really work fast and hard to make our concerns heard again.
So do you think people should be doing outreach right now, as as outreach is going on with the Muslim community and getting that on top of the list? Because a lot of times foreign policy issues are placed as Muslim issues, but issues like CVE are not on the list as we're going into talking, doing outreach. to the campaign, the Biden campaign?
I think that every individual and group has to make the judgment for themselves as to what they think is important to be in a candidate's platform. We are a nonpartisan organization, so we don't give platform points to either organization. We just have the policy position.
Okay. So now going on that, like where, so if someone wanted to research under the Trump administration, what is it currently called? What is CVE currently called?
Well, I think, oh gosh, that's a really interesting question about CVE, I'll tell you, which is that, one of the really, I think, sort of emblematic indicators of how tainted the idea of CVE is in Muslim communities is that everybody who runs a CVE program refuses to call it CVE. They always have like other names, like, Building Peace or something like that, and they always change their name, and they always sort of try and hide the fact that it is a CVE program, which just tells you how much suspicion these programs generate amongst Muslim community members. Right now, a lot of the discussion has been around threat assessments and around, targeted violence is sort of the new term. And targeted violence prevention is what they're looking for. And that also is not just about CVE, but to some extent also conflates, efforts to identify school shooters or people like that guy in Las Vegas whose motive was never discovered, who killed, hundreds of people. I guess it was about 2 years ago now. So there's this sort of kind of broadening of the umbrella even further, even away from countering violent extremism to sort of, countering, all kinds of targeted violence. And that's sort of the current language that we're looking at.
Mm. So how do you confront, and this is, I'm going to ask that question next, but one thing that I did want to mention is even the grants and the programs that are messaging specific, even those are so detrimental to the community, because now you're having the government decide what version of Islam is acceptable, what is okay to say and what is not okay to say, like who gets to speak for Islam. And I mean, we've seen this across the pond in the United Kingdom, where young Muslim women's magazines are CVE programs, and the articles are being written by middle-aged white men, pretending to be young Muslim women. Like, are there not enough young Muslim women who can run their own magazines and write what they feel like writing? So this is, and you get like the slick graphics, and it's like really expensively done, and you're like, wow, this is awesome, like a Muslim organization is putting stuff out, and then you'll find out. So that is something that when you had talked about messaging earlier, but there is this, we want to combat violence, but a lot of times that violence is the consequence of over-policing and the securitization of Muslim communities in the United States under this rubric of CVE. So how do we confront that?
Well, I mean, to your point about messaging, I think that, it's really interesting that you brought up the example of the UK, and that's the PREVENT program, right? And one of the big sort of scandals around that has been, the way that they have sort of co-opted Muslim issues, right? And now suddenly you have, as you say, kind of PR firms churning out things that they think good Muslims should say. And that it's kind of a form of government propaganda if you're honest about it, right? So, I'll say this, like, I don't think that the US CVE messaging stuff is nearly as serious as what's happening in the UK. For the most part, it is, people giving grants to sort of small groups who are kind of coming out with media campaigns that are focused on tolerance or inclusivity and things like that. But I think it does, on a kind of fundamental, so in practical terms, I mean, I guess I'm much more worried about the programs that are actually going to target people as potential terrorists. But, these programs are going on. Yes, they do, sort of put forward this idea of sort of good Muslim versus bad Muslim, which is a sort of a theme that runs through many things that we all work on. And I don't think they should do them. I also, frankly, don't think that they are at all effective. I think that, it's kind of funny that, they're searching for authentic Muslim voices, but if you're paying somebody, like, how authentic are they actually going to be, as opposed to, really kind of regurgitating or repackaging a message that they've been told.
And we're seeing also, like, and we saw this in Baltimore, in DC, that there's also a large targeting of African American, Black Muslim communities with these grants, and
with what?
With grants, here locally there was even school systems, and just so. And then it becomes even, what is a cash-strapped small mosque supposed to do when there isn't enough programs for money for social programming, and but then those are the same mosques that the first they'll be targeted. They're first in the road to be targeted. There was a mosque in DC, small little mosque, that when that truck driver mowed people over in New York City, here in DC, police officers came, and MPD came into the mosque and just asked the imam, so has there been anybody talking about mowing people over with a truck? And these are just sort of like and then already, like, and anytime they come in, what they don't realize is these mosques are like, they are the safe havens for troubled youth. They're coming in, really turning their lives around, like Ayaan was saying. But even in the African American community here, and now because they see a cop car outside, there won't be anybody for Jummah for the next 5 weeks, because who are you with? Like, what side are you on? Right. So and a lot of times they're Muslim police officers who are in, so it's there's so many layers to this that, so, as we're wrapping this up, like, what I would like to get your final thoughts on, what should the Muslim community be doing at this point? And, just could you, and especially under COVID, like the surveillance level is going to rise. Are there any concerns that the Brennan Center has for the American Muslim community, or just Americans at large?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's a lot of questions. I think that, the sort of example you gave of the small mosque in the DC area and the difficulty of sort of, it's very difficult to work with the government and have the trust of your community. And obviously, if, cash is always attractive, and, we've certainly seen this, not just in the Muslim community, but also other communities, right? This is not a new problem, this idea of, some portion of the community kind of wanting to be friends with law enforcement, et cetera. Oftentimes it's a generational divide as well, where you see sort of, sort of older people taking a more cooperative stance, and younger people taking a more confrontational stance. Not always, but that's often the case. And so, but I do think that, Muslims need to take their place in America as full citizens, right? And we need to stop thinking that, we have to sort of constantly demonstrate that we are good citizens in order to be accepted as citizens at all. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be good citizens, but just that it's time, and it's obviously not possible in this administration, but maybe in the next administration, or 2 or 3 administrations from now, that we need to kind of normalize and desecuritize the relationship between the state and Muslim communities. Because I think that for the state, Muslim communities are seen only through the lens of counterterrorism, but Muslim communities and individuals have concerns that are far more broad ranging than that, right? Like most people are wondering about, the state of the roads, or, their kids' school, or whether they have a job tomorrow, and whether they're going to get sick with COVID. I mean, these are like the basic things that really actually kind of bind us all together as Americans. And those are the things that should be at the forefront of our relationship with the state, and not so much the focus on counterterrorism. I understand that's an uphill battle, but I think that's kind of where we want to be at the end of the day. In terms of the COVID-19 surveillance, I mean, so far, our government's response has been so hapless that I don't know that they've have really put in place surveillance systems. But I think that, we certainly have to be careful that any surveillance systems that are put in place are actually strictly limited to public health needs, and that the information that's collected for public health purposes is used for public health purposes rather than for law enforcement or other purposes, and particularly immigration is something that I would be worried about in that context. I mean, it's definitely a space that we're watching very carefully. And so that's, definitely something that people should keep an eye on as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for being with us, Faiza. And I know you're super busy, and but this is a very important conversation, especially during this time. And I've just kept feeling that people have stopped talking about CVE, and I wanted people to start thinking about it again, especially with elections coming up, and with everything else that is going on. This is something to keep in mind, especially with the rise of white supremacy. So thank you so much for being here. And to our audience, please go do visit the Brennan Center's reports. Look at their work. This is very, very critical work that they have been doing in support of communities everywhere. And especially the Muslim community owes them a big one, that they have, put out these policy papers and really studied how what junk science goes behind CVE policies. So thank you. We'll be here with you tomorrow. And thank you from Justice for All and Muslim Network TV.